Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to the Liasa IGBIS webinar, your interest group for bibliographic standard in South Africa. My name is Meshia Moriane, and I'm the chair of IGBIS. Thank you for choosing IGBIS today. Today's presentation is titled Metadata for the Development of Local Taxonomies Towards Africanization. So the presentation will focus on the prevalent use of Western taxonomies as authoritative access points, overshadowing indigenous and subject-specific knowledge systems. Through an exploration of the Environmental Learning Resources Center at Rhodes University as a representative entity, the session will shed a light on the disconnect between the language employed and the controlled vocabularies used to categorize research outputs. It will also highlight the significance of representing subject specialization with an Africanization context while advocating the use of Wikidata as an upper ontological linking framework within the semantic web, fostering a more inclusive and diverse landscape of knowledge representation. So our presenter will discuss how through metadata we can bridge the gap between local content, language, and the controlled vocabularies that we use. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to remind you that the session will be recorded and shared on the Liasa News YouTube channel, and the link will be emailed to all registered attendees and to the Liasa IGBIS social media pages. If you have a question or comments, please feel free to type it in the chat or Q&A boxes. And you may also raise your hands during the Q&A, which will be moderated by our PRO, Sarah Golby. And please mute your mic when you are not speaking. There will be a photo shoot at the end of the session. We request your participation in this regard. I will now introduce our guest for the day, Wynand van der Walt. Wynand is the Senior Manager, Innovation, Systems and Collections at Rhodes University Library, as well as Director of CAIMS Africa, a consulting and training services company for the knowledge and information provisioning sector. Wynand holds a master's in IT from the University of Pretoria and is currently enrolled for a PhD at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. His areas of interest are leadership for innovation, digitization and digital curation, scholarly communication, indigenous knowledge systems, fluid in ontologies and the semantic web and how it affects information-related technologies. Colleagues, let's put our digital hands together and welcome Wynand. Wynand, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Moshe, and thank you everyone for being part of this morning's session. I was really looking forward to the session for two reasons. One is I don't have all the answers, and I've just gone through the list of attendees, and hopefully, and I see the names there of the people that can definitely provide input as well. As a bibliographic standards committee, what I hope to achieve today is to ensure that going forward we can align our efforts in addressing some of these key issues. Knowing that, as I said, we don't have the answers. All the answers we are fumbling to some extent, but we have a very good structure in place. Fortunately, my two colleagues I see is online as well. They're very much involved in this. And if I just want to share my screen, apologies for that. Let me get there. Right, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can, Wynand.
Thank you so much. All right, you've already gone through the abstract, so I'm just going to skip the abstract. So, sorry, where's my pointer now? I've lost my pointy thing here. Now it's moving this side and not that side. All right, but what is important, sorry, there's going to be a lot of theory this morning. But what I hope to achieve is that through listening and through thinking, that you can re-perceive your position as the Bibliographic Standards Committee in terms of, how do we go forward with this? I see the logo for this year's LIASA event as libraries with social cohesion. And one of the questions I can ask immediately is, well, how would bibliographic standards actually impact social cohesion? What are the implications, or how can we go about doing this? And I think we have to understand that we can play a critical role in how we shape and make accessible information, but in a different way than we have done up to this point. And you'll see why as I go through all of this. Some of the background. So as metadata librarians, or as librarians, you would obviously work with structured knowledge representation, meaning that you would use authority records, you would use authority systems, including, for instance, you would use Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress, etc. And we've been applying these standard tools over a number of years without really thinking about the representativeness necessarily, or questioning the representativeness of those tools, but not really having the broader voice to really change those taxonomies. And this is what also is going to be part of the challenge going forward. What role will ICBIS play in ensuring representation of African knowledge structures, whether it's indigenous knowledge structures or subject-specific knowledge structures within the metadata structures that we, taxonomies, controlled vocabularies, etc., that is out there. And part of this is also how then do we add value to the ontologies to ensure fluidity within a semantic environment. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. That's a whole different session on its own. But just looking at from a basic perspective, yeah, we work with thesauri, which is just a classified list of terms. We work with taxonomies, which is a classified list of concepts and relations, and ontology, which is the upper level, which is a specification of shared conceptualization of certain concepts. Now, all of three of these deal with natural language, and at the same time in a very structured way. And I think we all agree that going forward with the advances in computer science and information science, etc., we need this more than ever because people can't find information. Yes, yet we flood it with information from all over. Yet we also, at the same time, we understand the disparity between the representativeness of local knowledge, local outputs, etc., versus what's available international. So we realize that the web, if I may use it in its broadest term, is very much a Western-based tool, and we have to now come in and we have to make changes to ensure that we are represented fairly and equitably within the semantic environment. So ontologies, part of this, there's a distinctive and expression of rich relationships between terms. Now, this is important going forward because you can also now link the ontologies with each other in the knowledge structures out there. So when you're looking at a knowledge graph, for instance, where you have, if I can just give you an example, if you have metadata structures in a specific language, you can equate it and create a relationship to a different taxonomy with the words in another language, for instance. All of this is at a computational level, meaning that we don't have to do it from a natural language or observer perspective. It is really about allowing machines to do what they do best, but we have to obviously implement the structures to optimally showcase the information. All right, so all of this, why is things important? Two big reasons: discoverability, which I already mentioned, we are drowning information, but starved for knowledge, for instance. And the second, decolonization. Now, I used Africanization, decolonization in its broader sense. I think each of us have a different perspective of what it means. But I prefer the word Africanization, and the reason being is that I'm not trying to remove or deconstruct something. I'm rather aiming to facilitate a process where African knowledge structures are optimally placed within the broader scheme of things. So it's not moving from one to the other, but rather embedding to some extent. So the representation of our indigenous knowledge systems, it's marginalized. I mean, if you were to search for knowledge African knowledge, whether it's specific languages, whether it's a specific topic, etc., you will find that, yeah, there's not a lot of visibility in terms of our own contexts. Yet we've got this vast pool of research being produced at so many levels in different languages, yet it's not visible in its totality, except if you really have a very good search prompt that you know and aware of. So the marginalization is through the knowledge organization processes. How is knowledge actually organized in the world? And we also have to acknowledge there's more than one way. There's a plurality of knowledge systems. There's alternative knowledge structures in place. So one is not better than the other. There's different reasons for why we have all these taxonomies. As a matter of interest, if you just want to know, if you think about subject taxonomies, there's about 1,780, if I remember correctly, of subject-specific taxonomies alone. Yet libraries focus on Library of Congress. And I keep on telling well, one catalog and now two at Rhodes, we'll get more soon, hopefully. You know, would a researcher, and I say this with all due respect, he would not go and search under a generic term like fish or Pisces or something like that. He would use a specific language in order to obtain the data he wants. But our metadata doesn't cater for that kind of knowledge structure. When we use Library of Congress or something similar, it is so generalized in reality. And I'm one of those that's calling for a complete removal of the generic taxonomies and rather focus on the subject and localized taxonomies for knowledge representation. Whether it be then looking at, for instance, for fish, you would look at, or ecology, you would look at the zoological descriptors, whether it be Latin, etc., doesn't matter. The fact is that it's a subject, a structure that is used by all the experts in that field across the world. So it's not about what we want to use, it's about what are the actual users using to describe their information and how they incorporate it into our practices and behaviors on our side. There's also the request for a lot of increase in personalization of digital libraries. And we are not going to get to a point where we have a researcher's persona match up with a taxonomy for a specific retrieval process if we do not consider more areas of specialization, whether it's on two, well, in this case, it's two levels, one on the researcher level, which should be fluid, and the other on the side of the information application itself as well. And this is where we're working with fluid ontologies, where the ontological structures will be dependent on who is asking for what, where, for instance, and then bringing in the fluidity at that level. Right. This is just one example of the absolute disconnect or misrepresentation or bias within a structured framework, knowledge structure. This is, as I think all of you can see quite clearly, this is Dewey. And this is just one example. We have the whole 200 range up to 8, 9, all about Christianity, basically. And from 290 to 299, you have all other religions in the world. And this is most probably the most, I don't know how to word this, but if somebody says there's no bias in our knowledge structures, then they haven't seen this representation. We have so many other religions. Imagine not just, I'm talking about world religions like Islam or etc., Zoroastrian, or, you know, one of the, I'm talking about African religions specifically, or, you know, where do we fit in? And a very long number, somewhere on a shelf. And this is the kind of battle that ICBIS, I think, will need to take forward, is that there's this equal representation and the removal of any bias in these knowledge structures. This is just but one example of how terrible it is, actually, and it is shocking. And one of the things as librarians, obviously, we have to maintain objectivity. So whether you're Christian or not, the fact is that this is totally misrepresentative of the religions across the world. Right now, Chantal Clack is also online, I believe, and and she's done a lot of work in this regard. So I'm actually the mouth, and she's the one that actually does the work. But she's online, and she can interject at any time and correct me. I'm not ashamed of being corrected. I'd rather stand corrected, as a matter of fact. So at Rhodes, we have the Environmental Learning Resources Center, and one of the projects that they came to us is a 40-year knowledge commons project, where we have to describe 40 years of knowledge outputs. And those outputs take various formats, whether it's research articles, books, just thoughts on paper, etc. When we started looking at this, we realized that the language they use in their subject field at Rhodes, now this is environmental education, is very specific, and that's called a taxonomy. Now, taxonomies, you would all know taxonomies from terms of where you can have the community tag an item. That's most probably the latest form of taxonomy. And that taxonomy is basically just a common use of a language to describe that knowledge structure. Now, there's a disconnect between the taxonomy and the controlled vocabulary that we apply to describe the very materials. And we said, no, this cannot continue, because they use a language. They're gonna follow through in that language in terms of wanting to retrieve information, but also wanting to describe the information for reusability and discoverability, obviously within their subject field, which is then environmental learning across, I don't know, Southern Africa, for instance, or African continent, etc. Also keep in mind that knowledge representation is actually a social construct. Sorry, just hang on. So when we talk about Africanization, one of the first questions that come up, are you talking about translating it into an African language? Or are you talking about, doing away with anything from the West, etc.? No, that's not the point. The point is about Africanization. It's really about localization of a knowledge structure within a certain case, where we have indigenous knowledge structures already potentially in place. Now, one can consider the taxonomy created through the use of this, of the ontology within the subject field, as a representation of a specific localized context. And what we also realized that on top of all of this, you have to have a backbone within your semantic environment. And Wikidata is considered as the upper ontological linking framework in the semantic web. Now, the semantic web itself, as the word describes, it's really about the meaning associated with the concept. And one can, and I think there were actually examples where a word used by the ELRC, apologies, where the term used by the ELRC is in fact in the Library of Congress subject headings. However, the meaning associated with it differs. That's a form of localization, and Chantal can actually tell you more about that. So what we're looking at also then is, all right, well, if that was the background to all of this, what are the actual questions we have to address? Well, we've already spoken about the disconnect between localized subject language used and controlled vocabularies. We also spoke about the knowledge representation as a social construct within a semantic environment. Also mentioned the representation of subject specialization. Also, to what extent are Africanized knowledge structures represented in mainstream vocabularies? I can just imagine the battle to have something addressed that's only considered of importance to South Africans, for instance. Would our Global Master Library of Congress actually respond kindly? I was sure they would do kindly, but at what level of priority and in what manner? So we have to question the representativeness of ELRC developed controlled vocabulary as representative of the broader subject environment as well, because what we also don't want to create an additional bias or a new bias by now creating a taxonomy that describes the subject field, but again, it's excluding certain things, and I think I do have the limitation somewhere. Also creating a possible new bias. So what is the agreement within the subject field within a localized area? And what is meant by localized area? So are the equivalents of environmental learning resources centers at the other South African institutes, sub-Saharan environment, for instance, and the list goes on. And we also have to consider the level of the linked data representation of above into the ontological linking frameworks within the semantic web, which I'll touch on slightly. All right, now here's one example, not from the ELRC, this is from a different collection. Now, this is sorry, the wording might be very small. This is a plant specimen, a herbarium specimen, and it's held by the Salma Shoreline Herbarium at the Albany Museum Rhodes University Collaborative. It was taken in, the photo was taken in 1925. Sorry, not the photo, apologies. The plant specimens were collected and catalogued in 1925. And when I looked at this, I thought, well, what am I going to use? Am I going to use Library of Congress to describe the actual subject versus the keywords? What am I going to do? So I can't remember. I think we used, if I remember correctly, we used a combination of taxonomies to describe them. This is still a part of our investigation processes where we used Library of Congress. Well, I think we removed that, but we also have the plant-specific taxonomy applied. So you would see the Latin Christus sepalum exfoliatum as a subject, for instance. However, you would also notice, and the description field, more or less in the just below the middle, you will see vernacular plant names: Mbundu, Mkuvu, Mkue, which is and Bushman, it will be called Viku. Where are those knowledge structures, and why are they put as a description with secondary keywords, etc.? So even the language representation is missing in this case. Sorry, you can stop me if there's any chats. Can I increase the font? Unfortunately, not on this one, Mandla. On the next slide, it is bigger, but on this one, it's very small. So I do apologize for that. But this is just a example anyway. So what I'm asking is, to what ICBIS, what role does will ICBIS play going forward in terms of knowledge representation of indigenous knowledge structures? And, you know, it's not just about adhering to international standards. This interest group will be critical in establishing the standards for South Africa going forward, or Africa, or etc., working with the counterparts. So it's an incredible responsibility on ICBIS to take this forward. All right, I do apologize for the small font on this one. But yes, the bigger font. So when I looked at the literature, and you would see this takes a study, because this is part of my study with Bayreuth. I had to look at understanding controlled vocabularies, taxonomies, and ontologies in knowledge organization and knowledge representation. Now, as librarians, I think this is something that we've neglected to a large extent, is that we would apply standards within a knowledge representation, but without really questioning the knowledge representativeness. And hopefully that'll come out as well. So I also looked at previous studies on controlled vocabularies, taxonomies, and ontologies in academic context. I looked at the Africanization of knowledge representation in academic settings, and also the level of inclusion in linked data environments, and also looking at challenges and opportunities of incorporating African perspectives into ontologies. And this is still an ongoing study. The methodology, well, looking at the ELRC as our case study, and this is where, Chantal, you can come in at any time and also add to this. We sat with them, and specifically Chantal did a lot of work in this regard, where they would then, based on their taxonomy, meaning their language, they would supply us with a list of the words or terms or concepts they want to be associated with the research output. And then Chantal will go about checking how whether this is represented in any current knowledge structure like Library of Congress subject headings or elsewhere. If not, then we know we have to add it. And if it is there, whether it's actually understood in the same way as described. So the data collection itself was identification and analysis of existing taxonomies within the ELRC and the Rhodes University Library Information Service. Then looking at a list of taxonomic subject terms assigned to research outputs by the ELRC team. Chantal would then come in and say data and analysis techniques. She would list of matches with controlled vocabularies, in this case, specifically library economy subject headings, and identify a list of new entries for ELRC taxonomy, and also correlate this with Wikidata representation. Just to see, I think, if I'm right, to see whether there's a Wikidata entry for this, a Wikidata record. Please don't confuse Wikidata with Wikimedia or Wikipedia. Wikidata is one of 14 projects the Wiki organization has, but it's the most critical one in knowledge structure representation. All right. Going forward, what happened is that, back that stage, going forward, we looked at developing guidelines for creating and maintaining ELRC controlled vocabularies. We need to integrate the taxonomic ontology into the ELRC's knowledge management system, meaning we also have to consider their knowledge management systems as well. We also have to publish the controlled vocabulary online with unique identifiers. That's part of your standard linked data on your metadata records. So we can't just create this and not have it accessible. People would want to know where people and machines, where did we find the subject? What is its identifier or what's its numeric value? So we have to publish this online. We haven't done so yet. And then once it's published, we also have then to link these published terms to Wikidata entries through the various identifiers, because if you don't link these identifiers, you will have a break in your semantic flow. And then we have to create Wikidata entries where needed, including indicating relationships between concepts where needed. So as you can see, our metadata librarians and subject experts are slowly becoming affay with the wiki environment, but specifically with Wikidata more than anything else. All right. Now, the one thing that we're not there yet, and this is where we'll need input going forward, how do you know if your taxonomy is working or not? How do you know if it's representative, if it's sufficiently representative, etc.? So one of the things I looked at, well, how do you assess the effectiveness of locally developed controlled vocabularies in, first of all, representing subject matter within a localized setting, but also through getting feedback from ELC staff and stakeholders on its usability and relevance. So the first part will be, well, look, how effective it is will be determined by how easy it is actually to find information and retrieve it, depending on, obviously, on the search environment. And then also, obviously, the feedback from the ELC staff themselves about how well this is actually suiting their needs and how relevant it is. And there's factors to consider about this as well. And iterative refinement based on evaluation results. So we know that we have to go back and back and back and refine this. Now, in terms of evaluation and validation of taxonomies, I found Rath and Cruz to be the most comprehensive, which talks about the accuracy as one of the criteria, including the definitions, descriptions, classes, properties, etc. The completeness, if the domain of interest is appropriately covered in this ontology, which is very difficult. Conciseness, adaptability, clarity, computational efficiency, which is critically important. And this is the measurability of the used tools to work with ontology, in particular the speed that reasoners need to fulfill the required tasks. Meaning, is this embedded to such an extent that computers can actually find information and through our discovery layers or through the semantic web can actually make those connections and provide fluid responses. And the consistency describes that ontology does not include or allow for any contradictions, which can happen. We also know there's other things that we have to consider. So one of the things that I had to look at is limitations or implications of future directions. We have to look at the contribution to knowledge organization theory and practice. Is this something that we want to embark on or not? I believe we don't have a choice. We have to embark on this. How successful we will be in our generation or the next generation, that I'm not 100% sure. There's implications for Africanization of academic knowledge representation, which is a good thing. If you ask, I mean, if you really want to know what can ICBIS do towards Africanization, this is most probably one of the key projects. There's also recommendations that we can make for other academic institutions and organizations. However, we don't want just one recommendations. We want to work collaboratively with the other organizations And there's other future research directions that I also don't want to go into at this point in time, which have to do with the fluidity of ontologies behind the scenes. All right. In summary, a reiteration of the importance of Africanized ontology in academic settings. I think it's not a nice to have. This is a necessity. We have to have our indigenous knowledge structures optimally configured and conceptualized and expressed to allow for information retrieval. It's not just for information retrieval, it's for information retrieval in terms of the fluid semantics, meaning that if a secondary level scholar, a primary or secondary school scholar comes and they want to know about plants, what is their language limitation? Then what are the implications of a language limitation on able to retrieve the information, even if they have access to Google? So one can see the criticalness of ensuring that the language representation, and we have 11 official languages or 12 official languages. Above that, what other languages do we also have to consider to ensure a more holistic language representation within the taxonomies and ontologies, and how do we ensure there's linking for absolute fluidity, meaning that anybody can find what they're looking for in the language of their choice, and to add to the fluidity at the level of their being as a researcher, meaning that you don't want the same information to be displayed to a primary school child that you would expect it to be retrieved by an academic with a PhD. And that's where we're looking at the fluidity of things, also considering the persona of the actual researcher as one of the factors contributing to the fluidity. There's some final remarks, which I'm going to skip, and just references. Sorry, it was actually possibly a bit shorter, but I would rather have additional time for discussions. Yeah, I don't know if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Wynand, for a thought-provoking presentation, and to share a light on the question about the role of ICBIS in the representation of knowledge. Last year, around on the 7th of November, we had a webinar on a SEICO Global Collaboration for Authoritative Cataloging, whereby we discussed the issue of contributing to the subject. And after the webinar, there was a discussion with the Library of Congress regarding the formation of an African funnel. So we are still in discussion in terms of just to form an African funnel, whereby as Africans, we can be able to contribute our subject, and then thereby enhancing the representation of our African knowledge and in the global discourse. So we will share the information as soon as we get an answer. So I will then hand over to Sarah to moderate the Q&A.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us and Wynand for, as Mersha said, it's an extremely thought-provoking session, and I think there's a lot to unpack there, and it gives us a lot to think about for the future. And so let's see if anyone has some comments or questions thus far, and of course you can continue to put your questions into the chat box. I see we have had one from, apologies if I get the pronunciation incorrect, it's S.H. Plaiki. He says, good morning, Wynand. Do you perhaps have any example of taxonomies as linked data at section 5 of your presentation?
I think it's a very interesting question. No, I don't. The reason being is that you would not use a taxonomy because that's more, you would use a controlled vocabulary within your linked data. What you need to do is you have to take the taxonomy and make it a structured knowledge organization. And then as an authoritative file, you would then link to it within your linked data elements or through your linked data elements. So I would not take a taxonomy. What we do is we take a taxonomy. We, in this case, which is the taxonomy. And sorry, I had to say as well, if you Google taxonomy, you would pick up a lot of tagging, social tagging. Now, this is where the concept comes from. Originally, not the social tagging, but where social tagging comes from, is where you have a group of users apply concepts to an environment that they often use. That's what it is, taxonomy. So don't focus just on the social tagging, rather just focus on the tagging, meaning the language they use within their field. So that language is normally not structured. It is not necessarily agreed to in terms of the meaning of the concept. However, it's used colloquially. So you would then create an authority file or taxonomy, and then that's what you would then point to in your linked data elements. It's exactly why we go through the route of having to publish it, and then once published also have to create your Wikidata entries, so that when it comes to the linked data elements, like you would normally point your URL within, I don't know how many of you do linked data, but where you have your authority URL, authority URI in your schema, you would have the authority, you would have the value. You have to indicate those in certain ways, and those are URLs normally. And that's why it has to be published online. And sometimes we would use the Wikidata the Wikidata QID as the identifier, for instance, within that specific taxonomy. I hope that answers the question, Waiki.
Thanks, Maynard, for your response. Colleagues, attendees, you're welcome to put your questions into the chat, or I think you can raise your hand on this platform if you would like to speak up. I just wanted to add that I think sometimes, well, I know, I mean, looking at Wikidata, that can sometimes be an intimidating thing to sort of contribute to. But I see recently that an open online course has been developed. I think it's about 5 weeks duration, and anyone can join so that you can learn how to contribute to Wikidata. So I think this is something that we can look at if anyone finds, you know, just jumping into Wikidata is a little bit too intimidating. And I will post the URL to that so that people can take a look. Let me just put that in there quickly.
If I may, so one of the things I did not mention, and specifically the people working in archives would pick up on this, is that within the GLAM sector, you would have to now also look at the consistency of language use across the GLAM entities. So that's your galleries, libraries, archives, museums. And that's another problem where we have applied authority files or taxonomies or ontologies within our sector, but another entity within a sector uses a different approach. So the archival staff will also have to come in and say, look, what do we agree to? And if you really want to see that the disconnect is actually going to work in archives, because you see the knowledge representation, for argument's sake, if you look at King Charles or King George or whatever European, and versus going to look at one of our local kings and its representation within the knowledge structures, you'll see the vast difference. And also the other reason why contextualization is important, it has to also, we've been applying certain things in certain ways from a Western perspective, where certain concepts like the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Colony would be assumed to cover South Africa at a certain point in time. However, the King of Mpondoland, for instance, would not have recognized or given any recognition to Cape Colony as being a valid entity. So what would his context be in terms of describing something during a specific era or an event at a certain point in time? We cannot apply the Western authority file that says, Cape Colony onto a person who did not actually even consider it to be valid at all, because their truth, their lived experience was different. So how do you ensure you've got these multiple realities expressed at the same time through these knowledge concepts or knowledge structures, and allowing for it to actually interlink? So it's not in competition, but rather it complements each other to form a holistic picture of what happened at a certain time. Just an answer to that, Mpondoland is just the English word for what their country was called. It was definitely not called Cape Colony. This is just one example. I know it's a very simplistic example, but that's a kind of contextualization that you have to consider, especially when it comes to archival materials, and more so in terms of, as part of Africanization, to your lesser representative groups on this continent, because we really just focused on the colonist as the knowledge creator, and not the other way around. So we used the colonial knowledge structure to describe environments which should not have been described in that way. So that's another aspect of Africanization that we have to consider. Thank you, Sarah. I don't know if Chantal wants to, sorry, I don't know if Chantal wants to add anything to this discussion from her experience.
Let's see. If Chantal would like to, Apelile, is it possible to bring Chantal into the discussion?
Hi. Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, Wynand has certainly encapsulated everything that we've done. One of the things I just want to say, especially in regard to the ELRC project, which is our first project like this with a university department, is that you do need experts in those fields. You know, a lot of us are aware of some of the terminology, the taxonomies, which they are akin to keywords, you know, as opposed to structured subject headings that we use. But you definitely, in this case, we need experts in that field. You know, some of their keywords, their terminology in their taxonomy would be so vague to us, you know. My favorite one always was one of the words that they wanted to put in as a subject heading was more than human, you know, which doesn't mean anything to us as catalogers, but to them as experts in environmental education, it has a very definite meaning. And what they have done, we're working very closely together with them, and they have a master's student that they have contracted to create these terminologies, you know, these headings on Wikidata. So now, for instance, with me cataloging their theses on our repository, you find a lot of the same terminology coming up, things that they have put into different subsections, into little collections in their overall taxonomy. And so I would then forward these to him to create onto Wikidata so we could put that into our catalog records as linked data. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Chantal. Again, I think that highlights the necessity of collaboration and the fact that catalogers and metadata practitioners, we also have to look outside the profession for the purposes of knowledge representation, because we won't know everything. And we are very focused on standardization. Obviously, we also have to focus on the interoperability of the vocabularies that we use for this. And I think that is why we do rely so much on controlled vocabularies like Library of Congress, because they provide a uniformity, that we don't get from tagging with taxonomies. And I think that is also something that we need to look at, because I just see SH Plike says, thanks, Venon, for your response. I'm old school. I sometimes understand more by looking at the examples, as these are the new development concepts. And I think that's true for a lot of catalogers. We are very practical people. We like to see things in action after the conceptualization.
Yeah. Now, I can tell you that the relationship between myself and Chantal, I think, is very good. But she does bring the practical level to things, where I think I'm more on a conceptual level. And that's what you need. You need both. And you also talked about collaboration, and I think, just to add to it, what we need, the people we need to collaborate with in going forward are also the linguists.
Yes.
Because that is also representative of indigenous African languages. It's also critical going forward.
Yes, definitely. I agree with that. Okay. I think, if people aren't able to put in their questions or comments at the moment, maybe, there's a lot to unpack in this presentation, a lot to think about. Is there any way for attendees to get in touch with you, or would you be open to having people contact you directly with their thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I really don't mind, and I do apologize that this seems very convoluted in terms of different concepts. So I do understand why people are probably hesitant to ask questions as well. It wasn't a practical session, and maybe as a next session, one can do a more practical thing from Chantal's perspective and from the ELRC, just to add a totally practical level to all of this. But you are more than welcome to email me. My email address is w.vanderwalt@rehza. And you can just Google it and you'll find it anyway. Because we also, as I said, we also need to work with people to find a solution that will fit all of us. And we don't, we've sort of been, grappling in the dark to some extent. So it will be very helpful if your comments come through as well, not just questions, but if you find it exciting, if you find it good, then yes, please also respond in that sense.
Thanks, Venant. But definitely, philosophical foundation is always necessary to practice. So these concepts are also incredibly important to mull over and to consider.
Yeah.
I see a comment from Madeleine Duprius: combining controlled vocabularies with free indexing terms or taxonomies are the way to go. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this presentation too.
Oh, brilliant.
Okay, then. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague, Ingrid Henrici. She's going to close off the session for us, I think. Ingrid, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, what insightful and very interesting talk that we've had. I want to ask you all to please put on your cameras so that we can have a photo session. So if you are willing to be in our photo, please put on your cameras now.
Oh dear. I think with this this Zoom platform, we're not able to do the photo shoot like we normally do. Yeah. Liasa
Okay.
National Office, I think, has changed their subscription with Zoom. So
Yeah.
they're not. We always used to have a shoot at the end for everyone.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
unfortunately
Okay.
we can't do so this time.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for that. All right. Well, Wynand, thank you so much. It was really very insightful and great learning opportunity. And I think it's, as Sarah has also said, it's really something that we need to unpack more. And we hope to be able to provide more guidance and information as we go ahead in the year with IGBIS. We are going into the end of our current term of office, but we still have some things planned ahead. And yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your
It's a
input.
pleasure.
Okay,
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
and that's the end of
Thank you, everyone.
our